I can't say that I came to Vietnam. I guess I would have to say that the Vietnam War came to me. In 1965, I was a sophomore in high school, Villa Park High in Orange, here in California. And I had a great history teacher by the name of Gary Long, he circumvented the globe for us. And I remember one day he came into class and he said, "Tomorrow we're going to have a debate on the war in Vietnam. And Mark, I want you to take the con side." I'll never forget going home to my dad and saying, "Dad, what's Vietnam?" And of course, my dad, who had a background in aeronautical engineering, knew about the war. He was a very learned person, very well read, and he sat down and told me what he knew about the Vietnam War, and helped me to take the side against the war way back in 1965. As far as my military service, you'd have to. I couldn't couple that with the Vietnam experience. I served in a unit after 9/11, and how I came into that service was kind of interesting. 9/11 happened. I was looking around for something to do that I could, you know, help my country, because I hadn't done it back when I should have, back during the Vietnam War, in my opinion. And a friend of mine who had been in Vietnam, Jim Kakavo, who had been in Vietnam with the Red Cross, actually. He had an Army background, but he went to Vietnam as a civilian, called me up one day and said, "Hey, our unit needs public affairs officers," being well aware of my background as a journalist. And I said, "Jim," I said, "I'm 50 years old." And he said, "Doesn't matter in our unit." So I put in 8 years down in Orange County at the Joint Forces Training Base down in Los Alamitos as a public affairs officer. I was writing stories and taking pictures of troops that were mobilizing for and demobilizing from Iraq and Afghanistan, and getting stories in Army publications such as Soldiers, which is the U.S. Army magazine, The Grizzly, which is the magazine of the California National Guard, and many others. So that's basically a two-pronged question. That's how I would answer that. As far as who has influenced me or shaped my opinion about the war, it has to be people who were there. I could name so many people. Janet Woods, who retired a few years ago as a reservationist for Alaska Airlines in Arizona, was what was called a donut dolly. She worked for the Red Cross, and she would go into base camps and bases and bring our GIs a little bit of home, and came back with the same PTSD that the guys that went over there came back with in many cases. I remember her telling me that she went to a Vietnam Veterans of America meeting and said to the guys at the meeting, "I've got PTSD," and they looked at her and they said, how did you get PTSD?" Well, then she sat down and told them her story, and she became one of the club. So many of these people that have, felt the confidence in me as a listener and as a writer to write their stories, have helped to shape, whatever my opinion, as fluctuating as it has been since 1968. They've helped to shape my opinion, and they're the reason why I feel the way I do today. Regarding my family during that era, my family was against the war. I did mention how my dad sort of guided me to an anti-war position. Remember, one of the things he said to me was that 80% of the people of Vietnam would have voted for Ho Chi Minh. I think my father's position was it's curious because he was a World War II veteran. He was in the Army. He was in the Army Air Corps. Served in the South Pacific as a radio man. Came home, went to engineering school at USC on the GI Bill, class of 1950. And he had two careers, but his first one was as an aeronautical engineer, and in that time he worked for example, Hughes Aircraft and other companies that he headed up. And he and his companies fulfilled many government contracts, among them parts for the Nike and Polaris missiles, parts for the gyroscopes on B-52s that were bombing, Indochina, and even parts for bombs that were dropped on Vietnam. So perhaps that was what weighed heavy on his mind. My mother was a Holocaust survivor, and I think if you know anyone who's ever lived through something like the Holocaust, um, they get very overprotective of their children. But I think that was the genesis for how they felt about the war, and I kind of slid into that position.